The Society of Friends, also known as the Friends Church, but better known as the Quakers, are a Christian group that came to power around the mid-17th century. And the way that they're different from most religions is that they generally focused on building relationships with God on their own and through their own thoughts, rather than having clergies or other normalized forms of teaching religion like we see today. Their upcoming teachings and perceptions on how God works is very different and has made its impact on all sorts of different religions today. Even though there are not as many Quakers as there used to be and they're not as well known or very popular, they still contribute to society in many ways. So, firstly, I'm going to talk about the Quakers' upcoming. Now, Quakers used to have meetings to find spiritual help through other churches and preachers that claim to have direct contact with God. This spiritual help being known as the inward light, which we'll talk about later. Now, in these meetings, they had a lot of famous people that actually came. Two of those people being George Fox and James Naylor. And these people would come into these meetings and they would claim, they had direct contact with God and, more contact than a normal person would have had. And so this would sort of persuade more people to become Quakers and sort of help guide their inward light, which I'll tell you more about later. So it would generally just persuade them more. But this started around 1652, and most of these meetings took place at Swarthmore Hall in Lancashire, which is a county in northwest England. But within 10 years, an estimated 20,000 through 60,000 people had already been converted to the Society of Friends. So I guess you could say the religion was moving pretty fast and was getting pretty popular. But next I'm going to talk about the Quakers' teachings. Now, they had a lot of strict and different rules, I guess you could say. Some of them kind of weird, but some of them were understandable. But first and foremost, one of their most strict rules that they had was you cannot participate in war. That was like bottom line. You just couldn't participate. The Society of Friends was really sort of against violence, and they just didn't like war. Another teaching that they had was bankruptcy ended in becoming disowned from the Society of Friends. So if you ran out of money, you just couldn't be a Quaker. And bottom line, I mean, sucks, but just how it was. The refusal of tithes, oaths, and other worldly amenities was also one of their rules. Another big rule that they had was you couldn't deal or own slaves, which that was a big rule because the Society of Friends, if anything, was more focused on bringing people together. So you couldn't have slaves and be a part of the religion. But breaking any of these rules often ended in discipline. So that kind of drove people to stay by their rules and not break any of the policies they had and be good Quakers, basically. And the next point I'll talk about is their outlook on God. Now, the main theme of the Society of Friends is the inward light. And now what the inward light actually is, it's sort of a broad term, but it's best described as sort of each person's individually like learning God's will for them through their own thoughts and reasoning. It's not really their conscience, but it's just them and their perception of God and what they learn in these meetings that sort of redirects their conscience and reasoning. So in these meetings that they have, often it would just be a bunch of people in a quiet room just sort of almost meditating, sort of how you see in church today, just people praying and being in God's presence. And everyone would have their own inward light, and they would just just meditate and focus on God through that time. And most of these meetings were very quiet and often very boring, but it was really good. The environment was really good for them to sort of grow on their inward light, I guess you would call it. But to sum it all up, the Society of Friends was, I guess you could say, a very conservative religious group that is different from certain religions and also similar to a lot from what they have learned in their religions. and the way that it teaches and perceives certain aspects of God. Even though some of the Quakers' points were sort of ridiculous, or some might think that they're not, some might think that they're perfectly reasonable, it still influenced a lot of different religions today all around the world. But thank you for listening, and have a nice day.